My son got $11 million dollars and threw me out. 3 days later, he was begging for my help. My son Lucas became a millionaire just 3 days ago. Today, he handed me a single suitcase and told me to get out of the home I'd lived in for 40 years. He inherited $11 million, dollars, and I got this. The sound of my own front door locking behind me in a storm. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 10 times, each gong landing like a hammer blow to my heart. Outside, a summer storm raged over Charleston, the wind rattling the antique window panes of the Holloway family mansion. But the real storm was right here, in my own living room. The air, thick with the humid South Carolina heat, felt impossible to breathe. My son, Lucas, didn't place my suitcase down. He threw it, the worn leather case, the one my late husband, Richard, had bought for me on our anniversary, skidded across the polished hardwood floor and slammed into the leg of a mahogany table. It was a sound of finality, a sound of disrespect. Clara, his wife, stood just behind his shoulder, a shadow in a perfectly tailored dress. She was the one who held out the papers, a neat stack of white against the gloom. Her expression was one of practiced sympathy, but her eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "To make things simple, Mother," she said, her voice smooth as venom. "You just need to sign here. It confirms you are leaving voluntarily, so we can more easily take care of the estate." I stared at the document, but the words swam before my eyes. My mind was still a fog of grief from Richard's funeral 3 days ago. Shock was a heavy blanket, muffling my thoughts, slowing my reactions. I looked at my son, searching for the boy I had raised. I found nothing but a stranger. "Lucas?" My voice was a whisper. "This is my house now," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. He just stared at a point on the wall above my head. "You should go." His words were the final push I needed to shatter. I felt something inside me break. Clara pushed the document and a pen into my hand. My fingers were numb. My hand trembled as I took the pen. The same hand that had once rocked him to sleep, tended to his fevers, and held him when he cried. I signed my name, Margaret Holloway, on the line she indicated. A single tear escaped and landed on the page, blurring the ink of my own name. I hadn't even read what I was signing. It didn't matter. In that moment, the betrayal was so absolute that the details were irrelevant. The sound of the paper being ripped from my grasp was as sharp and cruel as a blade. Clara tucked it neatly into a leather portfolio. Lucas turned, picked up my suitcase, walked to the grand front door, and opened it. The roar of the wind and rain filled the house. He placed the suitcase on the porch, then looked back at me. There was no pity, no regret, nothing. I walked past him, a ghost in my own home. I didn't look back at the portraits of my ancestors on the walls or the chair where Richard used to read his paper. I just walked out. The heavy oak door shut behind me with a deafening click. The lock turned. The rain lashed against my face, cold and unforgiving, mixing with the tears I could no longer hold back. Standing on the porch of the home I had built, with nothing but a single suitcase and a shattered heart, I was no longer the matriarch of the Holloway family. I was just a 69-year-old widow, cast out into the storm by her own son. 3 days before the storm, the world was a sea of white lilies. Their scent was so thick, so cloyingly sweet inside the old stone church, that it felt like I was drowning in it. It was the day we buried my husband, Richard. The pews were filled with the most respected families in Charleston, their faces a blur of solemn sympathy. I sat in the front row, a black veil doing little to hide the tremor in my hands. My son, Lucas, stood at the pulpit, delivering a eulogy that would have made his father proud. His voice, thick with unshed tears, filled the hallowed space. He spoke of Richard's integrity, his quiet strength, his unwavering love for his family. He painted a picture of a titan, a patriarch, and a loving father. He had the whole church, myself included, eating out of the palm of his hand. I saw not a 41-year-old man, but my little boy, heartbroken over the loss of his hero. A wave of love and pity washed over me. He was the man of the house now, and I knew he would rise to the occasion. When he returned to the pew, his eyes red-rimmed, I squeezed his hand. Clara, his wife, immediately shifted closer to me, placing a cool, comforting hand on my back. "Don't you worry about a thing, Mother," she whispered, her voice a perfect blend of sorrow and resolve. "We will never, ever leave you alone. We'll take care of everything." I leaned into her touch, grateful for her strength. In the chaos of grief, her words were a lifeline. I believed her. I believed in the sincerity of my son's tears and the warmth of my daughter-in-law's embrace. They were my family, my rock. I was so lost in my own sorrow that I didn't notice the small details, the things a clinical psychologist should have seen. I remember turning my head for a moment to look at the large, framed portrait of Richard we had placed near the altar. He looked so handsome, so alive. When I glanced back, I caught a flicker in Clara's expression. She too was looking at the portrait. For the briefest of seconds, the mask of the grieving daughter-in-law slipped. What I saw in her eyes wasn't sadness. It was something else entirely. A flash of icy, triumphant hatred so profound it made the air go cold. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the same gentle, concerned look she had worn all morning. I blinked, convinced I had imagined it. Grief plays tricks on the mind, I told myself. My own pain was projecting shadows where there were none. I dismissed it as a phantom, a figment of a shattered heart. Now I know better. I wasn't standing next to a daughter-in-law. I was standing next to a wolf, patiently waiting for the shepherd to fall. She was playing her part to a T, and I, the grieving widow, was her most captive audience. The whole funeral was a stage, and they were the lead actors in a play whose tragic ending was written just for me. The suffocating scent of all those lilies wasn't a tribute to a life well lived. It was a warning, a sweet, sickening omen of the decay that was about to consume my own. A few nights after the funeral, the three of us sat down for dinner in the formal dining room. The long, polished mahogany table, which had hosted decades of Holloway family celebrations, felt cavernously empty with just the three of us. The house staff had prepared Richard's favorite meal, roast chicken with rosemary, but the gesture of comfort felt hollow. The silence was heavy, broken only by the clinking of silverware against porcelain. It was Lucas who finally shattered it, and he did so without a shred of grace. He leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk on his face that I'd never seen before. "The final transfer came through this morning," he announced to no one in particular. $11 million. It's all there. He said the number with a reverence that turned my stomach. It was too soon. The grief was still a raw, open wound, and he was talking about money as if he'd won the lottery, not lost a father. Clara shot him a subtle warning glance before turning to me, her face a mask of gentle concern. She completely ignored his crass announcement. "Mother, we were thinking, there are so many loose ends to tie up with Richard's accounts. And of course, your own finances. It must be overwhelming." I took a slow sip of water, my eyes fixed on her over the rim of the crystal glass. "I'm managing, dear." "Of course you are," she said. her voice dripping with sweetness. But you shouldn't have to. You should be resting, grieving, not worrying about paperwork. She paused, placing her fork down with deliberate care. Lucas and I were talking, and we think it would be best if you signed a power of attorney, just a simple document, to let Lucas manage your personal finances for you. We can invest everything, make it grow, so you can enjoy your retirement without a single worry. The proposal landed on the table, as perfectly presented as the roast chicken. It sounded so reasonable, so helpful. But every instinct I had, honed by 40 years as a clinical psychologist, screamed trap. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. The careful, rehearsed speech. The way she avoided any mention of a nursing home or taking away my independence, framing it instead as a favor. It was a classic manipulation tactic. Present the cage as a sanctuary. My husband had always said, "The sweeter the bait, the sharper the hook." A cold knot formed in my stomach. I looked at Lucas, expecting him to chime in, to back her up. But he was just looking down at his plate, a puppet waiting for his cue. He wasn't the one pulling the strings here. I placed my own fork down, meeting Clara's steady gaze. I had to choose my words carefully. "Clara, that is an incredibly generous offer," I began, my voice calm and even. "And I appreciate you both thinking of my well-being. But I've been managing my own finances for a very long time. I think, for now, I'd like to continue doing so. It helps me feel normal." The rejection was gentle, but it was a rejection nonetheless. And for a fraction of a second, I saw it. The mask slipped. The warm, caring expression vanished from Clara's face, replaced by a flash of pure, undiluted fury. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes narrowed into slits of ice. It was the same coldness I'd seen at the funeral, but this time I wasn't mistaken. This time, I was looking for it. Just as quickly as it came, it was gone. The smile returned, a little tighter this time. "Of course, Mother," she said smoothly. "Whatever makes you comfortable." But the damage was done. The warning bell that had been ringing faintly in the back of my mind was now a deafening siren. They didn't want to help me. They wanted control, and my refusal had just confirmed it. The pleasant dinner was over. A silent declaration of war had just been made across the mahogany table. The tense silence that followed my refusal at dinner was a fragile thing, and it shattered completely just 2 hours later. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, and the first clap of thunder was like a starting gun for the final act of my betrayal. We were in the living room. I was staring out the window at the rain lashing against the glass when Lucas walked in. The meek, sullen man from the dinner table was gone. In his place was a stranger with hard eyes and a cruel set to his mouth. He was holding the document from the night of the storm, the one I'd signed in a haze of grief. "What is this, Lucas?" I asked, beyond, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. Clara appeared at his side, her arms crossed. The pretense was over. Her face was a mask of cold triumph. "You had your chance, Mother," she said, her voice sharp. "We offered to help you, to manage things for you. You don't trust us, do you?" Lucas finally spoke, his voice dripping with accusation. It was the same tactic abusers have used for centuries, twisting the victim's caution into an attack on their own character. "After everything we've done? After that beautiful eulogy I gave for Dad? This isn't about trust. It's about my independence," I said, my own voice gaining a bit of strength. Lucas let out a short, ugly laugh. "Well, if you don't trust us, then you certainly don't need us to take care of you anymore." He threw the document onto the coffee table. It was the paper Clara had handed me on the night of the storm, the night he'd thrown my suitcase. But this time, He pointed to the fine print at the bottom, the words I had been too blind with shock and grief to read. "You've already agreed to that," he said coldly. "You signed a statement confirming you are leaving the property voluntarily. It's all perfectly legal." The penny dropped. It wasn't a penny. It was a 10-ton weight crashing through the floor of my world. The document wasn't a simple confirmation. It was a confession, a surrender. I had signed away my own home. My refusal to give them power of attorney at dinner was the trigger. They had a backup plan, and I had walked right into it. The scene from the storm, the suitcase, Clara's words, it all snapped into focus. That wasn't the beginning of the attack. It was the end of a carefully laid trap. My breath caught in my chest. The feeling wasn't just pain. It was a deep, searing humiliation that burned hotter than any grief. I, Margaret Holloway, a woman who had spent her life reading people, untangling the complex knots of the human psyche, had been played for a fool by my own son and his venomous wife. As if to add the final calculated insult, Clara pulled a checkbook from her purse. She scribbled something quickly, tore out the check, and tossed it onto the table next to the document. It fluttered down like a dead leaf. "Here's $500, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "For your expenses." A check, not cash. A transaction, recorded and filed. It was a severance payment, a dismissal. It was the cruelest, most clinical way to throw me out. I stared at the check, then at their faces. There was nothing left to say. They had won. I had already signed my own eviction notice. Numbly, I stood up, walked past them, and went to the front door. The sound of the lock turning behind me was the last sound I heard from the life I once knew. As I stepped out into the raging storm, the cold rain on my face was a small thing compared to the icy emptiness that had taken root in my soul. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The motel room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. The walls were a sickly shade of yellow, with long, spidery cracks in the plaster and a patch of peeling paint above the bed that looked vaguely like a map of a country I never wanted to visit. The only light came from a single buzzing lamp with a stained shade, casting a jaundiced glow over everything. It was a universe away from the warm, elegant lighting of my Charleston mansion. It was rock bottom. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the storm that still raged in my heart. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I had nothing. 69 years old, and all I had to my name was a suitcase and $500 in a checking account I couldn't even access yet. My hand drifted to the small, carved wooden box I'd placed on the nightstand. It was Richard's. He had called it his thinking box, a place where he kept things that mattered. It was one of the few personal items I had grabbed in my days before leaving the house. My fingers traced the familiar grain of the wood. Opening it felt like having one last conversation with my husband. Inside, nestled on a bed of worn velvet, was the expected item. A thick, cream-colored envelope with my name written in Richard's familiar, steady hand. But beneath it lay things I did not expect. A small, old-fashioned brass key, heavy and ornate, and a slim, leather-bound notebook, the kind he used for his private thoughts. My heart began to beat a little faster. I opened the letter first. It was short and to the point. "My dearest Margaret," it read, "if you are reading this, it means I have failed to protect you from what was to come. For that, I am eternally sorry. Take the key and the notebook to Alan Pierce. He will know what to do. Trust him. And trust yourself. You are stronger than any of them." My hands trembled as I picked up the notebook. The pages were filled with his precise, analytical script. It wasn't a diary. It was a case file. and the subjects were our son and his wife. He had documented everything: Lucas's lifelong insecurities, his desperate, pathetic need to step out of his father's shadow, his weakness for flattery. Richard wrote, "Lucas doesn't want success. He wants the appearance of it. He is a hollow man, easily filled by the will of another." Then came the entries on Clara. They were chilling. Richard had been suspicious from the very beginning. He noted her flawless performance as the doting wife, but saw the cracks I had missed. "She looks at our family not with affection, but with the detached interest of a predator studying its prey," one entry read. He had done some digging. He hadn't found anything concrete, but he'd found whispers of a past she'd tried to bury, a family name connected to a business rival he had driven into bankruptcy decades ago. He ended his final entry with a haunting line, "I feel it in my bones. She harbors an inexplicable, deep-seated hatred for us. Her love for Lucas is a lie. It is merely the price of admission." The writing was on the wall, and I had been completely blind to it. As I read, the despair that had crippled me began to recede, replaced by a wave of ice-cold clarity. This wasn't a random act of greed. This was a meticulously planned takedown. A coup. Richard had seen it coming. He hadn't been able to stop it, but he had prepared for it. He had left me a roadmap. He had left me weapons. The sickly yellow room no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a war room. The grief for my husband was still there, a deep, aching void. But now, it was joined by something else, something fierce and powerful, a cold, calculated rage. They had mistaken my grief for weakness. They had mistaken my age for irrelevance. They had made a grave error. This was not the end of Margaret Holloway. It was the beginning of a war, and my late husband had just handed me the battle plan. Alan Pierce's law office was a sanctuary of quiet dignity, a world away from the transient despair of the motel. Located in a historic building south of Broad Street, the room was lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound law books that smelled of old paper and wisdom. Sunlight, filtered through the leaves of a sprawling oak tree outside, streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the rich patina of his antique mahogany desk. Alan, a friend for over 50 years and our family's lawyer, greeted me not with pity, but with a firm, knowing look in his kind eyes. "Margaret," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "Richard told me you'd be coming." He took the small wooden box from me, his hands gentle. He examined the notebook and the brass key, then nodded slowly. He didn't ask for the story. He already knew the shape of it. Without another word, he walked to a large, imposing portrait of a long-dead judge, swung it aside, and revealed the dark gray steel of a wall safe. He inserted the brass key, turned the dial with a series of practice clicks, and the heavy door swung open. From the dark interior, he withdrew a single thick document bound in blue legal paper. "This," he said, placing it on the polished surface of his desk, "is your husband's real last will and testament." My breath caught. He slid the document towards me. My eyes scanned the dense legal text until I found the relevant clause. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as a legal directive. Lucas was indeed granted full managerial control over the entire $11 million estate. But there was a condition, a hook buried in the legalese. He was required, within 90 days, to use $500,000 of the estate's money to establish and fund a charitable foundation. The foundation was to be named the Margaret Holloway Institute for Family Psychology. I looked up at Alan, confused. "I don't understand. This gives him everything but forces him to honor me? It forces him to play a game he's guaranteed to lose." Alan corrected gently. "Margaret, think. Richard knew his son. He knew Lucas's greed, and he knew Clara was whispering in his ear. He's handed them a $500,000 pot of honey, completely under their control, and dared them not to stick their hands in it. The brilliance of it hit me like a physical blow. He knew they'd try to cheat, I whispered. He knew they'd try to embezzle the foundation money. Exactly, Alan confirmed. It's a trap. A beautifully constructed, legally sound trap. Richard is giving Lucas enough rope to hang himself. Any fraudulent activity with a registered charity, that's not just a civil matter, that's a federal crime. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. We had them. Then that's it. We go to the authorities now. We expose them. Alan held up a hand, his expression turning grave. No, not yet. This is the hard part, Margaret. I made a promise to Richard. He wanted Lucas to have the chance to walk right up to the line and choose which side to be on. He wanted him to self-destruct on his own terms. My hands are tied. We have to let them make the first illegal move. The words were a bucket of ice water. I had been handed a sword, only to be told I couldn't swing it. My desire for immediate, swift justice warred with the cold, patient strategy my husband had laid out. He was asking me to watch my son and daughter-in-law steal from a charity named after me, to sit back and do nothing while they committed a felony. It was a bitter pill to swallow. I felt both armed to the teeth and completely shackled. Richard wasn't just asking me to win a legal battle. He was forcing me to engage in a psychological war. A war of nerves, of patience. A war played by his rules, from beyond the grave. To fight a modern war, I needed a modern soldier. Alan and I could pore over legal documents until our eyes gave out, but we were men of a different era. We needed someone who could navigate the digital world, someone who could trace money through the dark corners of the internet as easily as I could read a patient's body language. We needed my niece, Emma. Finding her took me to Atlanta, a city whose sprawling, modern energy was the complete opposite of Charleston's genteel history. She worked out of a cavernous, artsy coffee shop in a gentrifying neighborhood. The place smelled of roasted coffee, steamed milk, and faintly of turpentine from the paintings hanging on the exposed brick walls. Young people with laptops and elaborate tattoos filled every table. I, in my sensible tweed jacket, felt like a visitor from another century. I hadn't seen Emma in 5 years. She was my late sister's only child, a freelance graphic designer who had always kept our side of the family at arm's length. I spotted her in a corner, hunched over a glowing tablet, a pair of oversized headphones covering her ears. She looked different, older, sharper. A small silver ring was pierced through her nostril, and a complex tattoo of a raven snaked up her forearm. I walked over and gently touched her shoulder. She looked up, and for a moment, her eyes were wide with surprise. Then, the professional guarded mask of a city dweller snapped into place. "Aunt Margaret," she said, her voice flat as she pulled off her headphones. "What are you doing in Atlanta?" There was no warmth in the question. We sat down, a pair of strangers connected only by blood. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the whole ugly story, from the funeral to the motel room, from the fake will to the real one. I told her about the charitable foundation, the trap Richard had set, and my need for someone to find the digital breadcrumbs Lucas and Clara were sure to leave behind. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. She stirred her latte, the tiny spoon making small, circular scraping sounds against the ceramic. When I finished, the silence stretched on for a long moment. I expected shock, maybe even a little sympathy. I got neither. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Wow," she said, shaking her head. "Lucas always was a piece of work. So let me get this straight." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. After years of barely acknowledging my existence, you're showing up out of the blue because you need a favor? The question was a slap in the face. Emma, this isn't a favor. This is about your family's legacy, about justice for your Uncle Richard. My uncle who never once called me on my birthday? She shot back, her voice laced with old resentments. The family legacy that I was never a part of? No, this sounds like your problem, not mine. She leaned back, crossing her arms. Her next words were cold, clinical, and utterly devastating. So, I'll ask again. What's in it for me? The words hung in the air between us, brutal and transactional. Any hope I had for a familial bond, for a shred of loyalty, evaporated. I looked at my niece, with her hardened eyes and her calculated questions, and I felt a profound sense of loneliness that was deeper than anything I'd felt in the motel room. First my son, and now my niece. Everyone had their price. But she was right. I did need her. Her skills were the one weapon I didn't have in my arsenal. You're a freelance artist, Emma, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I will hire you. Name your rate. I will pay you for your time and your expertise. Consider me a client. A flicker of something, maybe respect, passed through her eyes. She named a figure that made me inwardly flinch, but I simply nodded. Fine, I said. You'll have a retainer in your account by morning. We shook on it, her grip firm and businesslike. I had my digital soldier, but as I walked out of that coffee shop and back into the unfamiliar streets of Atlanta, I had never felt more alone in my entire life. I was no longer fighting with family. I was fighting with mercenaries. A week later, I was back in Alan's office. The familiar scent of old books and leather was a small comfort in a world that had become completely unstable. This time, however, we had a third person in the room, or at least her face, projected onto a large monitor on Alan's desk. Emma, calling in from her Atlanta coffee shop, looked every bit the digital mercenary I'd hired. Her expression was focused, her eyes scanning lines of code on a screen only she could see. Okay, I'm in, she announced, her voice crisp and clear through the speakers. Lucas isn't a criminal mastermind. I'll give him that. His digital security is a joke. On our screen, she shared a complex flowchart of names, accounts, and numbers. It looked like a spider's web. He's been sloppy, Emma explained, using her cursor to circle a box in the chart. He used the initial $500,000 to set up the foundation, all above board. But 2 days ago, he made a move. A wire transfer for $200,000 went from the foundation's account to a shell corporation registered in Delaware. A shell corporation? Alan asked, leaning closer to the screen. A ghost, Emma confirmed. No assets, no employees. Just a legal entity designed to hide money. From there, the money bounced to 2 other accounts before landing here. She clicked, and a new window opened, displaying the logo of an investment firm. Orion Holdings Group. The name sounded impressive and utterly anonymous. It's an offshore fund based in the Cayman Islands. A classic money laundering setup. He's trying to wash the money before pocketing it. A cold, bitter satisfaction settled in my stomach. This was it. The proof. The crime Richard had predicted. Lucas had walked right into the trap. But Alan was squinting at the screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. He pointed a finger at a name listed under the fund's board of directors. Julian Croft, he read aloud, more to himself than to us. My God, I know that name. A friend? I asked it. Anything but, Alan scoffed, a grim look on his face. Croft is a shark, a corporate raider from the 90s. I dealt with him on a hostile takeover case 20 years ago. He's the kind of man who'd sell his own grandmother for a profit. He paused, a memory clicking into place. But that's not the most interesting part. The company he was working for back then, a ruthless little firm called Sterling Asset Management. He looked from the screen to me, and I could see the final puzzle piece sliding into place in his mind. "Margaret," he said slowly, "do you remember where Clara worked before she married Lucas?" The air left my lungs. Sterling Asset Management. The three of us were silent, the implication of Alan's words hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't Lucas's clumsy attempt to steal from his mother's legacy. This was a calculated move, orchestrated by someone far more intelligent and ruthless. Clara hadn't just encouraged Lucas's greed. She had weaponized it. She had handed him a loaded gun, pointed him in the direction of a federal crime, and told him to pull the trigger. She wasn't his partner. She was his handler. She was setting him up to take the fall, leaving her in control of the remaining millions. A shiver went down my spine, a feeling of dread so cold it felt like ice in my veins. My son wasn't a monster. He was a fool. He was a puppet, and I finally, truly, saw the hand of the puppeteer. My anger, which had been a confusing mix of pain and betrayal aimed at Lucas, now clarified. It sharpened into a single, deadly point, and it was aimed directly at my daughter-in-law. With the knowledge that Clara was the true architect of my downfall, my strategy had to change. This was no longer about catching a greedy fool. It was about outmaneuvering a predator. I needed to know their next move, and for that, I turned to a method far older than any of Emma's digital tools: old-fashioned surveillance. I spent 2 days parked in my modest Buick down the street from my old home, watching. On the third evening, my patience paid off. Lucas and Clara emerged, dressed for an expensive night out, and climbed into their gleaming black Mercedes. I followed them, keeping a safe distance, as they wound through the historic streets of Charleston and pulled up to a sleek, modern restaurant on King Street. The kind of place with more style than substance, popular with the new money crowd. I found a parking spot across the street where I had a clear view of the restaurant's large plate glass window. I watched them get seated at a prime table, and then my world tilted on its axis for the second time in as many weeks. 10 minutes later, a young woman walked into the restaurant and joined their table. It was Emma. My blood ran cold. This wasn't an ambush. It wasn't a confrontation. Lucas and Clara greeted her with wide smiles. A waiter poured her a glass of wine. They laughed. They leaned in, talking animatedly, their body language open and collaborative. I was a psychologist. I knew what I was seeing. This wasn't a family dinner. It was a business meeting. And my niece, my hired gun, was consorting with the enemy. I sat there in the dark, my hands gripping the steering wheel, for over an hour. I watched them toast. I watched Emma show them something on her tablet. My tablet, paid for with my money. The raw, visceral shock of it was a physical blow, worse than when Lucas had thrown my suitcase. His betrayal was born of weakness. This was different. This was a cold, calculated act of treachery by someone I had just begun to trust. Later that night, my phone rang. It was Emma, right on schedule for our nightly check-in. Her voice was as breezy and professional as ever. "Evening, Aunt Margaret," she said. "Just wanted to give you a quick update. I'm still running into some heavy encryption on the Orion Holdings account. It's taking longer than I thought to find a back door. They've got their digital tracks covered pretty well." The lie was so smooth, so effortless. It was almost admirable. I felt a strange, detached calm settle over me, the calm of absolute certainty. "I see," I said, keeping my own voice perfectly level. "No other developments then? Nothing unexpected?" "Nope, just the same old digital grind," she replied cheerfully. But don't worry, they can't hide forever. I'll get you something solid soon. I knew then what was happening. She wasn't just my mercenary, she was theirs too. She was playing both sides, feeding each of us just enough information to keep us paying, waiting to see who would make the higher bid for her loyalty. The auction was on, and I was just one of the bidders. The feeling that washed over me after I hung up was one of profound, crushing isolation. I wasn't just fighting my son and his wife. I was fighting a world where loyalty had a price tag, where blood meant nothing. My son was a puppet. My niece was a snake. The realization was as liberating as it was terrifying. I couldn't rely on lawyers, on family, on anyone. If I was going to win this war, I would have to do it myself. I was the only piece on the board I could trust. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. I called Lucas and requested a meeting. I didn't ask. I told him. My voice held a new authority that left no room for argument. I would be at the house in 1 hour, and I expected both him and Clara to be there. I walked through the front door of my own home for the first time since I'd been thrown out. The grandfather clock in the foyer seemed to tick a little louder, counting down the final seconds of a war that was about to end. I found them waiting in the living room, the very same room where my life had been torn apart. They stood together, a united front, but I could see the cracks in their armor. Lucas looked nervous, fidgeting with his cuffs. Clara was a statue of icy composure, but her eyes held a flicker of uncertainty. I didn't bring Alan. I didn't bring a briefcase full of evidence. I brought only myself. This wasn't a legal proceeding. It was an intervention, or perhaps, more accurately, an autopsy of a family. I sat down in Richard's favorite armchair, a seat of power I hadn't occupied in months, and looked at my son. "We need to talk, Lucas," I began, my voice calm and clinical, the voice I had used with countless patients. "Not about the money, not about the house, about you." He flinched. "There's nothing to talk about." "Isn't there?" I continued, ignoring him. "All your life, you felt like you were living in your father's shadow, a ghost in his own home. You were never strong enough, never smart enough, never enough. He loved you, Lucas, but his legacy was a weight you could never bear. You didn't want to earn his respect. You just wanted to take his place. You wanted the crown without the fight." Every word was a carefully aimed dart, and I could see them hitting their mark. His face paled. He looked to Clara for support, but I didn't give her the chance to intervene. "And then she came along," I said, my gaze still locked on my son. "She saw that gaping hole inside you. She didn't fill it with love. She filled it with poison. She told you everything you ever wanted to hear, that you were the smart one, that you deserved everything, that your father was holding you back. She didn't build you up, Lucas. She hollowed you out and made you into a puppet for her own revenge." Finally, I turned my attention to Clara. The air in the room crackled with tension. "It was never about the money for you, was it?" I said softly. "It was about him." I gestured to the grand portrait of Richard that hung over the fireplace. "It was about destroying his name, just like he destroyed your father's." Clara's composure finally, irrevocably shattered. A gasp escaped her lips, and for the first time, I saw genuine shock and fear in her eyes. "I know who you are, Clara Morton," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, but each word carried the weight of a judge's sentence. Or should I say, Clara Moretti. Your father was Antonio Moretti. He was my husband's business partner, until he got greedy and Richard had to force him out. Your anger isn't with Lucas. It's with the man in that portrait. You married my son's weakness to get revenge on his father's strength." The silence that followed was absolute. The room felt like a vacuum, all the air sucked out of it. Clara's face was a mask of horror, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. But the most devastating sight was Lucas. He was staring at his wife, his expression a chaotic storm of confusion, dawning horror, and utter betrayal. He looked from her stricken face to my calm one, and then back again. The war was over. I hadn't needed bank statements or wire transfer records. I had used the one weapon they never anticipated: the truth. The foundation of their partnership, built on a mountain of lies and manipulation, had just been turned to dust. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I had planted the bomb. I didn't need to see the explosion. I simply stood up, walked out the front door, and drove away, leaving the truth to do its work in the suffocating silence of that living room. Hours later, the phone call came. It wasn't Lucas. It was Alan. "Turn on the news, Margaret," was all he said. I did, and there it was, live footage from a news helicopter circling my home. The elegant historic mansion was bathed in the flashing red and blue lights of half a dozen police cars and black FBI vehicles. The scene was one of controlled chaos. The story, as I pieced it together from the reporter's breathless commentary and Alan's later explanation, was exactly as I had predicted. After I left, Clara had tried desperately to put the genie back in the bottle. She tried to soothe Lucas, to convince him I was a manipulative, senile old woman, that my words were nothing but the ravings of a grieving widow. But the house of cards had collapsed. He looked at her and saw not his loving wife, but a stranger, a predator who had used him as a tool. The final nail in the coffin came not from my words, but from a phone call. The investors from Orion Holdings Group, the sharks Clara had thrown him to, called to collect. They weren't polite. They made threats. They spoke of consequences, of men who would come to the house to ensure their investment was protected. Backed into a corner, with the truth of his wife's betrayal on one side and the very real threat of physical danger on the other, Lucas completely shattered. He was no longer a greedy man or a resentful son. He was a terrified child in way over his head. He ran from Clara, locking himself in his father's old study. Amidst the leather-bound books and portraits of his ancestors, he did the only thing he could think of to make it all stop. He picked up the phone and dialed 911. The call was a rambling, hysterical confession. He admitted to everything: the embezzlement, the shell corporations, the money laundering, and he gave them the mastermind. He told them it was all Clara. He sang like a canary, not to save himself, but to burn the whole rotten structure to the ground. Watching the news, I didn't feel a surge of victory. I felt a profound, hollowing sadness. The sight of federal agents leading Clara out in handcuffs gave me no pleasure. She looked small and defeated, her mask of cold superiority finally gone. A few minutes later, they brought Lucas out. He looked broken, a ghost of a man, his face pale and his eyes vacant. He was a deer in the headlights, caught in a fate he had helped create but never truly understood. The FBI raid wasn't my triumph. It was my son's tragedy. My phone rang again an hour later. It was from a blocked number. I answered. "Mom?" It was Lucas's voice, small and thin, from a phone at the police station. "I'm here, Lucas," I said softly. There was a long pause, filled with the static of a bad connection and the weight of everything that had been destroyed. Then he spoke 3 final words, his voice cracking with a sob he could no longer contain. "I'm so sorry." The line went dead. I stood by the window of my small motel room, watching the distant city lights blur through the tears that were now silently streaming down my face. The war was over. I had won, but the victory felt exactly like a loss. 6 months later, sunlight streamed through the tall, immaculate windows of the living room. My living room. But it was a different space now. The heavy, dark furniture that had held the weight of old family secrets was gone. In its place were comfortable, modern chairs arranged in a welcoming circle. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the gentle murmur of conversation. The Holloway family mansion was no more. In its place stood the Holloway Institute for Family Psychology. I stood before a small group of people, husbands and wives, parents and their adult children, leading a seminar on communication and trust. The words flowed from me with an ease and a passion I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just a psychologist anymore. I was a survivor. My theories weren't just academic. They had been forged in the fires of betrayal and loss. I had my life back, but it was a new life, one I had chosen, built from the rubble of the old. In the back of the room, managing the presentation slides, was Emma. The cynical, guarded mercenary I'd met in that Atlanta coffee shop was gone. She was still sharp and smart, but the hardness in her eyes had softened. After the arrests, she had come to me, shamefaced and apologetic. She confessed everything, how she'd played both sides, how her resentment had nearly led her down a dark path. She had received a small portion of the estate, as stipulated in Richard's will for extended family. And in an act of penance that spoke louder than any apology, she had invested every last dollar of it into helping me establish the institute. She caught my eye and gave me a small, encouraging smile. I smiled back. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real. We were two broken pieces of a shattered family, learning how to fit together again, building something new and better in the process. We were not just helping other families heal, we were healing our own. When the seminar concluded for the day, and the last of the attendees had left, a quiet peace settled over the house. Emma was tidying up, and I found myself standing before the grand portrait of Richard, which still hung in its place of honor above the fireplace. I looked into his painted eyes, and for the first time, there was no pain, no lingering questions. I had done what he had asked of me. I had played the game and won, but the victory was so much bigger than the $11 million or the house. I had lost a son, a truth that would always be a quiet ache in my heart. But I had found myself again. I had reclaimed my purpose, not as the matriarch of a wealthy family defined by its past, but as a woman defined by her own strength and resilience. The old Holloway legacy, with its suffocating traditions and unspoken resentments, was dead. In its place, we were building something that truly mattered, a legacy of healing. A warm afternoon sunbeam fell across the portrait, illuminating Richard's face. I smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that came from the very depths of my soul. I was home. I was free. I was the queen, not of a hollow kingdom of old money, but of a new one I had built with my own two hands. And it was a victory more complete, more absolute than I could have ever imagined. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.